Welcome back. It's time for week 3, and this time we're going to talk about Christianity, which was the major religion of Europe during the Middle Ages. Now, to really understand it, as with anything medieval, you have to understand the ancient context relatively well for anything in the Middle Ages to truly make sense, and that is very true of Christianity. Christianity emerged in the ancient world and was a product of antiquity. The main thing that really enabled Christian theology to be what it was Greek philosophy and the Greek philosophical process. So what I'm going to do is do a very brief run through of how Greek philosophy really shaped the way that Christian thinkers thought about the world and interpreted the Bible. If you really want to know more about this subject, there's a book called Constantine's Bible by an author named Dungan, and I would highly recommend that book. It's quite excellent, and it really helped guide me in making this presentation. On an intellectual level, Greek philosophy was the bedrock of all Western thought that came later, whether we're talking about Roman thought, Christian thought, or to a certain extent even Islamic thought. All of these things draw very heavily on Greek origins. Now, Greek philosophy is a very internally diverse subject. There were a lot of philosophers who came before Socrates, and some of them were more into the physical world. Some of them, like Democritus, believed in an atomic theory where everything in the world was made up of smaller particles. Turns out he was right. But along came a gentleman named Socrates, and Socrates didn't really care that much about materiality, and luckily for Socrates and his legacy, he had a student named Plato, and Plato took Socrates to the next level, wrote a bunch of dialogues like the Republic that you might have heard of, and after Socrates and Plato, pretty much everybody agreed, or most Greek philosophers agreed, that the thing that was most real and most important in life was the mind or soul, and that the body was just an outward and inferior manifestation of more important forces in the universe. Plato had a theory of the forms wherein you have a truly existing abstract notion of a thing, and then the thing you see in the world that makes you think of the form is an inferior shadow. For instance, there would be a perfect form of a table. So the table that you kind of see in your mind, if you just think of the word table, would be close to a form, but the table you might be using right now wouldn't really be a very good manifestation of the form, and it's only a pale shadow of it. And that just gives you sort of an idea of how Greek philosophers would really start to look at the world. There's sort of an abstract layer which underlies everything else, and that abstract layer is created by God and or the gods. Aristotle is usually seen as an empiricist. He was very interested in natural science. He really liked to observe things. He wrote all kinds of works, some of them about constitutions, politics, animals, how the human eye works, all kinds of stuff like that. But if you read his Metaphysics, where he tries to describe, what he sees as God and how the universe functions, it's very apparent that in his eyes that the mind or soul is what really governs the universe, and also our minds and souls are what govern all of our actions. And he categorizes that as being prior to and causative of all physical effects. Hopefully all this makes sense. If not, don't worry about it, because, we're not going to talk a lot about theology, but if you ever did want to study theology, you'd really need to start with Greek philosophy. So after Socrates, most philosophers would really focus mostly on things like ethics, politics, and metaphysics, rather than the physical universe, or what we'd call science. That doesn't necessarily apply to all Greeks. As I said, Greek philosophy is a very diverse thing. There were plenty of pre-Socratics who didn't give a damn about any of the things that Socrates cared about, like Anaxagoras, who was mostly interested in things like astronomy. There are the Epicurean philosophers who like to study society, and they like to look at the world as a material thing. They were mostly atheistic, so they were not as interested in sort of these abstract causes. They were more interested in the physical universe. And the Cynics seem to be sort of outside of this as well, although most of what we know about them is from sources hostile to them, which accuse them of all kinds of things which they may or may not have actually believed. So basically, the takeaway here is that Greek philosophy is the reason why things like the mind and the soul have such great centrality in Western thought, even to this day, or at least up until close to the present. Let's put it that way. As you may have been able to infer from the fact that I pointed out that there are exceptions to the rule, Greek philosophy was divided into many different schools of thought, which saw themselves as incompatible with one another. So basically, you would have a school of thought which would have a founder. So there's a school of Platonism. The founder is Plato. It would have its core text, so a lot of the dialogues you might be familiar with. You might have read in other classes, such as the Apology or the Republic. Those things would be the core text. There would be a system of doctrine. Doctrine comes from the Greek word doxo, which means opinion or belief. So there would be certain teachings within that school of philosophy that everyone would be expected to either assent to or argue against if they found it unacceptable. There's a line of succession, so there's always a head of the school, and he could date his succession all the way back to the founder. So Plato's Academy, there was always a single head of the academy who could date, trace back his sort of intellectual genealogy to Plato himself. And each school had some differing interests. Now, Plato's school was very much interested in things like geometry and ethics, the forms, all of that kind of stuff, whereas Aristotle's school was much more intellectually diverse in the sense that they also include a lot of physical things. Now, one of the forms of entertainment in the ancient world was actually for vigorous debates between scholars, and these would actually be attended by some fairly common people who may or may not have been fully literate. Keep in mind, there was no internet, there was no YouTube, and being able to hear professionally trained speakers talking about the nature of reality was actually about as entertaining as it got for a lot of people. So these debates were pretty common and pretty popular. And many of these basically professors were actually rock stars in their own day. Now, one interesting thing about Greek philosophy is that all of these debates, despite the fact that they came from people who adhered to doctrine, were seen as an ongoing process and not a matter of something that needs to be fixed and needs to be adhered to strictly and defended by force. So the schools of thought, the school of Plato, the school of Aristotle, the school of the Stoics, they all understood that their teachings were a little bit different and had evolved over time, and they thought that was justifiable because they had learned more about what their founder had actually thought, and that time had sort of revealed the true meaning of the text that they were still studying from their founders. As I mentioned before, one thing that was very important to these schools of thought was the fact that they had central text that they adhered to and studied. And that sort of obsession with textual purity and interpretation really started, or at least greatly intensified, during the early Hellenistic period after the death of Alexander, when the Ptolemies founded the library at Alexandria. One of, if not the very first of the chief librarians at Alexandria was Callimachus of Cyrene, pictured here in a much later drawing, probably from some 19th century book. And what he did is he composed a comprehensive catalog or index which really looked at all of the thousands of scrolls at the library, and he attempted to list all of the titles and authors. So up to that point, there wasn't quite as much of an obsession with who had written what. For instance, we have the name Homer attached to the epics of ancient Greece, but there have been people for many, many centuries now debating over who Homer was and if it was actually the same poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, this obsession with authorial accuracy really takes off because of Callimachus and his successors. So Callimachus was the type of guy who would look at the dialogues attributed to Plato and try to figure out which ones were genuine, which ones were spurious, and which ones might have been by, say, some guy named Plato who wasn't the famous Plato of Athens. So that process would begin, and various scholars would come up with different techniques, such as studying the way that people wrote, and they would use that as a point of comparison to try to figure out whether texts were genuine, spurious, or mistakenly attributed. And after the Alexandrian library starts to do this, they start to create standard manuscripts for different texts, and this really creates an obsession with getting issues of authorship right. Later on, people would say that in order for a school of philosophy to make a proper argument, it has to be based on a text that they can prove is a genuine text by one of their founders or one of the people who was entrusted with the headship of their school, and not just some forgery or some text that might have come from someone else and then been falsely attributed to Plato or whatever. Just so we're clear, this obsession with authorship went beyond philosophy. It applied to history and all other genres, including medical writing. Galen of Pergamum, who lived in the 2nd century CE, was one of the most prolific writers of his day, and he's considered to be one of, if not the greatest, doctors of antiquity. And he took an interest in the only other guy who could possibly challenge him for that title, named Hippocrates of Kos, who lived in 5th and 4th century BCE Greece during the classical period. Now, Galen really wanted to establish what was legitimately by Hippocrates and what was possibly by some other doctor of that period or one of Hippocrates' students. So he took the 60 works that people said that Hippocrates had written, and he only accepted 13 of them as genuine. And I assume that most texts since then have largely followed Galen's advice. After all, you too would follow the advice of someone who looks exactly like Callimachus. Also, fun fact about Galen, while we're on the subject, there is one story, probably from one of his rivals, that he was visiting the countryside and someone introduced him to a pain medicine that he had invented out of local herbs. And this was, something fairly comparable in effect to something like aspirin that could cure a headache. So, because Galen was so eager to become famous, he supposedly murdered this farmer, stole his idea, and took credit for it. Anyway, I don't know whether that's true or not. It was probably an abusive story by a rival, but it was fun, so I felt like I would share it. Our best source for how these schools of philosophy functioned and how they made their claims of authority comes from Diogenes Laertius, who was a 3rd century sort of, historian of philosophy is the best way to put it. He wrote a 10-book work called The Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. By the way, when I say books, that's basically the modern equivalent of a chapter. There wasn't very much you could fit on a scroll. So, for instance, if I ever assign a text and I say books, whatever and whatever, I'm not assigning whole books, so don't freak out. I know that will be the case this week. We're talking about books 3 and 4 of Augustine's Confessions. Don't panic. Those aren't that long. You'll be okay. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. So, what Diogenes does is when he looks at a philosopher in the school he founded, he focuses very heavily on which texts are genuine. And he'll either classify them as genuine, disputed, or spurious. Disputed just being that different people disagree about whether it's real or not. And then if it's genuine or spurious, that's where, almost everybody who's read it says, yeah, this is for real. Now, in any school of philosophy, authority came from having and using that founder's text, adhering to the founder's teachings through the correct interpretation of the founder's teachings, and that's what the successors at each school were for. And you also, to do that successfully, you really needed to maintain a pure text. So you needed to study the text and take out any impurities or copy errors. Because remember, texts were copied by hand in the ancient and medieval worlds. So if you really wanted to protect the integrity of a text, you needed to supervise the copying process very carefully and then go over your manuscripts and make sure that they were corrected if they contained errors. And that was one of the principal duties of the heads of these schools. And as I alluded to earlier, there is an academic attitude to discourse. I mean, academic in the modern sense. That is to say that philosophers would see their contribution as merely a contribution and not the end of a debate. So it's just like in history today, where people who write about ancient Greece might see themselves as advancing the ball of the field, and they might see themselves as changing the direction of how people think about something, but no one, or at least almost no one, is so egotistical as to think that his or her work will settle an issue forever on, say, I don't know, like how Athenian democracy functioned or whatever. And above on the other two slides, I gave you first a 19th century random illustration and then a bust, and here I decided to work extra hard for you and give you both. So there's the bust and there's the 19th century drawing where Diogenes is dressed like a mage. So you can choose which one you like better, because I'm just nice like that. You might be wondering, well, how does all of this actually apply to Christian theology? Well, very simply. Eventually, people who were elite enough to be philosophers began to convert to Christianity, and they brought their background with them. And obviously, as you might expect, people who had an elite social background wanted to also be elite within their church communities. So, whereas some other people might be more interested in things like running the church, if your training is in philosophy and you used to be an expert on Plato, you're going to want to now be an expert on Christian text. And if this is your educational background, you're going to use the tools and techniques of your trade when you are looking at these new texts. So, on a very simple level, that is why this applies. And it also is important to realize the first and most fundamental function of any scholar or philosopher is that you have to enjoy arguing with other people. And that's important because otherwise there are existing interpretations of these texts that you could just adopt, especially if you're looking at the Old Testament. You know, the Jewish tradition goes back centuries by this point, and they have their own interpretations of these texts. But if you're an elite Greek philosopher or a Roman trained in Greek philosophy or whatever the case might be, you don't really want to adhere to someone else's authority. You want to make your own impact. Again, you were born rich. You do not take orders from other people. And you chose to pursue, a level of skill in a technique of argumentation. So you enjoy arguing, and that's really what you live to do, and that's what you do best. So you're going to use all of the techniques that these schools used to use to debate each other, and were still using at the time, and you're going to apply those to Christianity. And people from other schools of philosophy will also convert to Christianity. They'll come up with their own interpretations, and now you have Christian theological debates going on. So that is basically how all of the great philosophical debates that occurred within Christianity started. Just the conversion of philosophers from the Greek and Roman world who were trained in techniques which allowed them to argue in very clever and persuasive ways. I briefly alluded to the Jewish influence in Christianity above, and you might be wondering why I didn't pay more attention to it up to this point. The reason is quite simple. Most of the Jews who would become prominent in Christian debates were Jews who had been Hellenized. Hellenize means to make Greek. In the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century, Jews had become incorporated into the Greek-speaking world, and they often were citizens in the Greek cities of the East. So that meant that a lot of Jewish elites would be very fluent in Greek and could read and write it, and they had joined in the many intellectual debates that had been taking place in the East, especially in Alexandria. And you often had public debates between, Jews and Greeks over various religious and political matters. That was a very common thing. And because some of these Jews had been so thoroughly Hellenized, many of them actually needed the Bible in Greek so they could really understand it, because they spoke that a lot better than they knew their native Hebrew. So for that reason, and because there were Greeks who wanted to study Judaism, there were many different translations of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, but the sort of standard translation was known as the Septuagint. And there would be many debates surrounding which versions of the Greek text were the most accurate translation, and one of the great early Christian philosophers would dedicate decades to that project, a guy named Origen. Anyway, the point of this is that Jewish scholars really adopted these Greek obsessions with textual purity and the concern of authorship, and we also see that they, possibly because of the Greek influence, but possibly because of their own traditions, also really take up this interest in, having debates and really parsing out things and, debating their views with other people. So this is basically the contribution that the Greeks and Jews of the East made to what would later become Christianity. So now let's take a brief examination of the contributions of the Romans and the various religions of the Roman Empire to Christianity in our next presentation.